Hi, I'm Larry Castle here with Ken Brown for episode 77 of That's a Good Question. What do pastors do all week? We had a good chuckle at the title of What do pastors do all week just before we started here, and I said we work on our follow-through, of course. but you're probably wondering, what do you do in the wintertime? So we'll tackle the subject anyways. These last couple of episodes, we've decided to kind of pull the curtain back and let our viewers, our listeners, in on some of the, something they may not have knowledge of and frankly may not care about, but just, some of the stuff that goes into leading a church, being a pastor. Yeah. So, the work that you and I do on a regular basis. So last week we talked about how pastors determine what it is they're going to preach and emphasize. And today we're going to broaden that a little and talk more generally about what we do as pastors. I was talking with a brother recently, and you were actually there during this conversation, and he asked out of sincere curiosity, so what do you spend most of your time on, and where would you like to be able to spend more time? And I think some folks just have no idea what does a pastor do all week. Right. Now, I think this brother had a good idea what we do. He was really just looking for what is keeping me busy and what would I like to spend more time on. I think he was looking for ways he could help. Yes. So, but sometimes I think people may not really have an idea. And, they know you teach once or twice a week. Mm-hmm. But, hey, besides that, what else is there to do? So how about you? Have you ever been asked that?
Well, I've not been asked in a way that implies that we're not doing much of anything. But I have been asked how the rhythm of my week goes, and that in turn gives me entree then to talk about what it is we do. Mm-hmm. But I think people do wonder, but are often just too polite to ask, as they don't want to be seen as making an accusation. Mm-hmm. Now, going back decades ago, about 35 years ago, when I was at our parent church, the church that sent me to plant Community Bible, where you and I both serve, the pastor at that church was asked what he does for a living. And to a guy who had been visiting for a bit, and he just said to him, so what do you do for a living? And he responded that his living is derived from his work at the church. And the guy who asked him just said, wow, just does not seem like there would be much to do.
He was thinking like I was joking about,
the one or two
you must
times.
Be really good at golf.
Or golf, yes, exactly. In fact, on the golf thing, there was a fellow who came to our parent church. He's still there, faithful member. But when he first came to the church, he had been at churches his whole life where the pastors were all excellent golfers. Now if I got any pastor friends that are watching and you're an excellent golfer, then I'm not criticizing you. But that was what they did. They golfed a lot, and he thought all pastors could golf. And he went out to golf.
You really disappointed him, didn't you?
He went out to golf, and it was the senior pastor. I wasn't the senior pastor there.
Okay.
It was the senior pastor he was really assuming was a good golfer. And we went out golfing one time, and we're both horrible. The senior pastor's horrible, I'm horrible. And this guy literally wept. He was wept with joy.
Oh, really?
Yeah. That his pastor has something else to do. Oh. Apparently something more important to do, yeah.
Well, glad you didn't disappoint.
So, people do wonder, what is there to do? And I think it's understandable because, as we've noted over the years, the Bible gives the forms of ministry, but not usually a whole lot about the functions. Mm-hmm. So if you read in the Bible, as people do, most people who are watching this have an interest in the Bible. You've read through the Bible, and you find a handful of things related to church leadership. And if you've never actually done those things, then it can indeed seem like it's really not that much. Mm-hmm. The Bible says that pastors preach, but it doesn't say a lot about what all goes into that. Mm-hmm. And I think many people believe that something like public speaking is really mostly a matter of knowing a little something about your subject, and then just having the ability, the gift of gab, the ability to talk. And so just with a relatively general outline, you can just get up and speak. And that's most definitely not what preaching is, but I think many people believe that.
Just as an aside, a young pastor that I'm acquainted with on Twitter said something akin to that
Wow.
this past week, and I thought, oh boy.
Oh boy, is right. Yeah, really. He
Yeah.
thinks that's his task. Or
He
that's the way it's
actually
going to go for him.
he actually listed. Sorry if you're listening to this, probably aren't. But actually said topics I can speak for 30 minutes extemporaneously on, and then just
Okay,
listed
and
them.
Here they are. Okay.
And,
boy.
well, and in his defense, I don't think he means that he does that regularly. I
Okay.
think he's saying if I had to, I could.
Well, and most of us, if we have to, we could.
Yeah.
But if you rely on that, and I've seen people do that, they begin to rely on that.
In youth ministry, if you have a special speaker lined up and they don't show up, you do that.
You have to rely. Okay, that'd be an instant
Yeah.
in season and out of season.
That's right. But you don't plan that.
But you don't plan it
No.
that way. Yeah. But you just think about how people think about public speaking, and you can see it when you see folks get a microphone in their hand.
Mm-hmm.
If you have a group and you're passing the microphone around, which we do on occasion,
Yeah.
but rarely, partly for this reason, honestly, because when folks get a microphone in their hand, many have little awareness of how long they're talking.
Yeah.
And understandably, because if you don't do it all the time.
Sure.
But I think there's an assumption that it's just sort of easy and that you can just get your thoughts out there. And so they don't understand how difficult it is to extemporaneously just get up and make your point. So if they can just grab a mic and then they can talk, if they think they can do that, well, then how much easier for you guys
Yeah.
who are actually trained speakers? How hard really can that be? I think that might be the thought process. But we may get a chance to talk a little bit about what goes into that. That makes it a bit harder than I think what many people think.
Yeah. Yeah. That's the trouble if you make it look easy.
Well,
if you do hard work and do a good job.
then it does look easier, doesn't it? Yeah, true.
Yeah. Yeah. So most people don't know how pastors spend their week, is how we started off talking about this yet. We think many may wonder about it.
Right.
It is probably a question that pops into people's minds. So why do you think church members might be in the dark about what we do? Why haven't we done a better job of explaining it?
As I've thought about, talking about it over the years, I've always had a hesitation myself to talk about it in the pulpit because it's never easy. At least it's not easy for me to, in effect, you're talking about yourself and what you do and your tasks and perhaps your burdens. And you and I both worked real jobs.
Real jobs.
Before we were blessed to be called to vocational ministry and make our living in it. And as a result of that, though, we have a sensitivity. I have a sensitivity, I know you do, to how hard it is to be a working man or a working woman. Perhaps you're raising a family. You have all the responsibilities that go with that. And yet you still try to not only attend church, but to actively serve in church. So as I talk about what I and we do in our pastoral role, I can say without hesitation, I'm not more busy now than I was then. I was going full throttle then and now. Because no matter my vocation, I am, like all Christians are, a servant who's been given gifts from the Lord, and we are all to seek to faithfully serve Christ's mission in his church. And I was doing that before I became a paid pastor, and I'm doing the same thing now, but just in a different capacity, as are you.
Yeah.
So I don't want to get in front of the congregation and then run the risk of sounding like, you guys have no idea all that I do. Let me tell you all about it, right?
Yeah.
I'm going to stand up in front of a congregation, and I'm going to say that to nurses and factory workers and custodians and cops and mechanics and housewives and teachers and executives, and the list goes on. So a major reason that, at least that our church may not know what all we do is because I haven't said much to the congregation, and I haven't said much because I don't think I'm more busy than others or more important than others, and I don't want to come off as if I do.
Yeah. But we don't also want to come off as if we do less than
is true.
others. And as you said, it'd be easy for people to think that there's not much,
Right.
since the Bible doesn't give a whole lot of detail about how, here's how a pastor's week is supposed to go. There's not the time management section of 1 Timothy, right?
Right, exactly.
Yeah. So do you think pastors have more to do now than in the first century?
I do. I think so, actually. And I say that because of what I mentioned earlier. The Bible gives us the functions of ministry in general, including the functions of pastoral ministry, but not the detailed forms, not the methods, not the manner in which it's carried out. So, for example, one of the blessings that we have in our context today that they didn't have in the first century are, for example, buildings. dedicated to church ministry. Well, that's a blessing because it means we can gather and disciple more people, and we can have places to carry out various discipleship initiatives. The first century did not have Sunday school, for example. Now,
Wait a minute. You're telling me
I'm telling you,
first century is not in the New Sunday school is not in the New
it's
Testament?
not.
All right.
And so many
Okay.
other things that we do that are
Yeah.
very good things and blessings.
Yeah.
As I'll mention, I think later, but extra biblical, but not unbiblical. And they help us carry out functions that the Bible gives us. But Sunday school is just a form to carry out the biblical function of education. But it's a great blessing to our children, to our families, and to our church. But in turn, because we can do that in ways that they couldn't, that also now means some oversight and some administration. And speaking of those buildings, the actual physical plant itself is something to which we have to give attention. That too takes resources, including time resources. So we have additional burdens that the first century didn't have in that sense, but they're burdens that produce blessings.
Yeah, come in the form of opportunities.
Opportunities,
Yeah.
exactly. They present additional ministry opportunities that are, as I said, extra biblical, but they are not unbiblical, and they help us carry out what is biblical. Now, just a side warning, whenever folks hear that, well, okay, that Sunday school is not in the New Testament, then why are we doing these non-New Testament things? And people easily get caught up in what some call a restoration mentality, that what we need to do is restore back to the means and the methods that they exactly used in the first century.
Authentic, primitive Christianity.
That's the idea, and you get a lot of people who get that. But the very reason the Bible does not issue details on how to do ministry is precisely so that ministry can be flexible for different times and places. Since the Great Commission is a worldwide mission. I mean, if it were locked into you have to do things a particular way, and you're trying to do a worldwide mission, and you go into all these different cultures, and you try to impose all of that. So that's why the Bible gives that kind of flexibility for us to use wisdom to carry out the functions God tells us to. So life in our churches today isn't better or worse. It's different. Another reason that I think people may not fully appreciate all that needs to be done by church leaders is something that I've said over the years, namely this. Every command for Christians to obey is a requirement for leaders to provide. Every command that the Bible says Christians are to carry out, well, then that places something incumbent upon us then to teach people about it, to give them avenues in order to carry it out if at all possible. So our job is not just to carry out what we're directly told to do, but also to provide ways for members of the church to obey what the Lord tells them to do. So the Bible teaches, for example, that we're to gather on the Lord's Day. Well, okay, who's supposed to make that happen? Come up with where? Come up with what time? What all has to go and be put in place for that to occur?
Yeah, this is also one of those things, if you've never had to think about it, you might think, oh, it's just an hour service.
Totally. And I show up.
Yeah.
And again, I don't really care other than in a forum like this just to inform people what pastors do. It's just part of what goes with it. But outside of that, I'm happy that people can come in and not concern themselves with what all had to go on behind the scenes. But I am certain that is what happens. Folks show up and have really no idea what happens. What all does it mean for a Sunday morning to take
I will
place?
say it is a relatively small group, though. I think at our church we have so many people
that
plugged
have
in
to get
serving
involved.
on Sundays.
We disabuse them of the notion there's not much
we
to
have
it.
a very high participation level. So
Praise God for that.
Yeah,
Yes, that's right. That's true. But what does it mean for a Sunday morning to get pulled off just for a single hour? Well, you've got to have people in place to give out information to folks that come in, to direct them. So that means greeters in place. That means ushers in place. That means somebody showed up before any of those people to actually unlock the doors, turn on the lights, make sure the heat's going in the winter or the air conditioning in the summer, that you got childcare for those who need that. You're going to collect an offering. So you got to have people who collect that, but that's not just anybody to collect. Obviously, you don't want just anybody collecting money. So you've got designated people and people that have been vetted and people that you trust to be able to do that. They've all been designated ahead of time. They're going to do that and they're going to count it. And then they're going to deposit it and they're going to record it and all of that. You got music. And the music people had to have come early and they had to have practiced during the week.
I was going to say that. Yeah, they put a couple days worth of work
Indeed.
into that.
And the sound people. the sound, audio-visual people. So you'll get up on Sunday morning and make the announcements, and behind you on the screen are graphics that are related to the announcements you're making. All that had to be prepared. All those had to be put in order. And you got somebody pushing the button, and that somebody's not you.
So they can hear me.
And so they can hear you
Or
audio,
see the
but then
graphics,
they can see the graphic as well. And you're not hitting any of those buttons. You got guys in the back faithfully doing that. The parking lot has to be ready. The walkways have to be ready, especially we're here in Michigan in the wintertime. And so we have brothers who get out faithfully, voluntary.
Yeah.
And they clean off the walks, and they put salt down and all of that.
Plow the lot.
The building's got to be cleaned and ready. Any publishing that we have to do to make people aware of what's going on. We hand out an outline for the message, and somebody's got to hand that out. But that all had to get printed ahead of time for just so many things, and we could make the list even further. I said child care, but then there's the older child care too. There's there's nursery and toddler, but then there's children's church
programs. Yeah. Several of those areas touch on areas of ministry that I either serve in or oversee here at CBC, and I spend a good bit of my time doing administrative things for those ministries. And I still have opportunities to preach and teach and other things that we'll discuss. But administration is a focus for me in pastoral ministry. So perhaps we should talk about the fact that pastors may have different emphases in their ministry, their area of church ministry. The Bible doesn't give separate qualifications for what we might call an executive pastor. So some people might be wondering why these different titles, why the division of responsibilities, why don't all pastors just do the same thing?
Okay, that is a very good question, I think. And I think that all pastors need to be able to do the same things the Bible teaches. For the same reason you gave, there's only one list, one list in two places, Titus chapter 1 and 1 Timothy chapter 3. But there's only the one list of qualifications for pastors, and you have to meet all of them in order to be ordained and to have conferred upon you the title of pastor. So 1 Timothy 3, 1 through 7, Titus 1, 6 through 9, they give the qualifications, and then those qualifications, if you look at them, they break down into two major categories. They're qualifications of character, what the person is like. Do they have godly, spiritual character? And then the other category is ability, character and ability. Now, character is the bulk of the list, and it's, of course, most important. If you have skills, if you have ability in someone who doesn't have character, that's a very dangerous thing. And we've seen many pastors implode and harm a lot of people because they were charismatic personalities. They could talk, they could lead, but they didn't have character. The two skills that those qualification lists tell us a pastor must have are teaching and management. So 1 Timothy 3, 2 says that a pastor needs to be able to teach. And then in verse 5, it says he has to be able to manage the church of God. So every pastor has to have the requisite character to be able to teach and to be able to manage, to administrate. But some, though, and here's where the division of labor then comes in. All of us have to have that. But some may emphasize one more than others in, and this is an important word, I think, for this, the practical division of labor. It's important to distinguish between, you can choose your terms, but essence and function. In essence, pastors are the same in what we are and in what the qualifications are. So if you're someone who has been ordained and is therefore called a pastor, it's because you meet those qualifications. In essence, we're the same, but in function, we are different. In our character and skills, the same, but in function, for practical reasons, we might agree to divide up responsibilities for the care of the flock so that some do more preaching, others do more managing. At our church, we have 4 pastors. 2 full-time. We're both full-time. We have 1 part-time, and we have 1 who owns his own business, but serves the flock faithfully outside of his work time. I have the primary responsibility, we've agreed, for preaching and vision. You have the primary responsibility for administration. Dr. Combs leads our Community Institute educational ministry, and Pastor Rich, who runs his own business, but he has a burden for men's ministry and finance ministry, and so he takes care of those. Now, we could mix and match those as needed. Nobody's locked in, actually, to any of those. But we found that division to be an efficient approach to ministry. So these qualifications of character and managing and teaching, those are roughly found in the titles that the New Testament gives for pastors, if you think about it.
Mm-hmm.
In the American church, we use the title pastor, which I love, shepherd.
Mm-hmm.
And that's a biblical title. But there are two other titles for the same person that are given in the New Testament, for that of elder and of overseer. You've got a couple passages that make that very, very clear. In Acts chapter 20, Paul has spent 3 years in Ephesus. He's leaving Ephesus. In those 3 years, he has developed, as his farewell indicates, they're weeping when he leaves, developed a very close emotional bond with the church and with the leaders there. And in Acts chapter 20, verse 17, it says he called the elders of the church in Ephesus together to then give his farewell to them. And as part of that farewell, now notice he's talking to the elders, but he says, keep watch over yourselves and all the flock of which the Holy Spirit has made you. And then he uses the word overseers. You elders are overseers. And then the next thing he says is be shepherds of the church of God. Elders, overseers, shepherds.
All right there in the same context.
And they're the same people. And then same thing in 1 Peter chapter 5. 1 Peter chapter 5, verses 1 and 2, Peter says, to the elders among you I appeal as a fellow elder. Okay, again, elder. But then he says, be shepherds of God's flock that's under your care, serving as overseers. So shepherds, that is pastors, and then overseers and elder. So what is all that?
Yeah, I just had somebody recently ask me, so why don't we have elders? And I said, and I was able to share that and say, well, we do actually. We we more commonly refer to ourselves as pastors, but it's the same thing.
Every pastor is an elder.
Yeah,
exactly. Yeah. And so the Greek words I think are interesting as well in the New Testament for these. Elder is presbyteros. So some of you will recognize that as we get Presbyterian from it. And so the Presbyterian form of government has something to do with the arrangement of the elders. But presbyteros means just an elder. And this is someone who is known for mature faith. That's what the elder idea emphasizes. But then you've got the overseer, and the Greek word for that is episkopos. So you get Episcopalian from that. In the King James, it translates that word instead of overseer as bishop. So that every now and then I think I'm gonna go with that sometimes and say somebody says why don't we have elders?
You guys
why don't we
know
have
this. That's what we refer to them in private.
the
Bishop Brown.
That's right. We could go. I mean, you could do that, and some churches do that now because of the connotations, unfortunately, that in church history that's taken on as some kind of extra ecclesial outside of the local church, something above and
kind
outside
of like
of
super pastor over a bunch of churches.
Exactly.
Yeah.
Because of that, we would avoid that. But it's a perfectly biblical term, but it means overseer, and then pastor, poimen, or shepherd. So the elder, as I said, emphasizes the character, overseer, management, and then the pastor feeds and leads the flock.
Yep. So as you mentioned, a lot of what I do here is administrative, but you also said we all preach and teach, even though we have different emphases in our responsibilities. I think it's important to explain that if it were not true that I, for example, teach but also counsel, marry and bury, as they say, and visit and other things. If it was all administrative, then that would really be more of what we would think of as a staff position, not a pastoral position. But the church ordained me, and all four of us were ordained by the church as pastors, not staff. We do have some folks that would be in that category of staff, and they do many, many things. Yes. Some of them are paid staff, just a couple paid staff, and then many volunteer staff. But as pastors, we carry out the functions that you mentioned, teaching and managing and shepherding. So let's talk more about the duties of a pastor. Whoever it is among us that carries them out with more or less emphasis than the others. So practically speaking, what's the job of a pastor?
Well, if you go to Acts chapter 6, which those who are part of CBC, we will be in Acts chapter 6 here in a few weeks as we're going through the book of Acts. We've gotten up to Acts chapter 5 now. So middle of February, we'll pick back up with our study in the book of Acts. So long about the end of February, early March, we'll be looking at Acts 6. And in Acts chapter 6, you'll remember that very first church ever in Jerusalem had as its first leaders the apostles. The apostles were the leaders. They served as the pastors. of the flock there. But then issues started to arise that required some additional management. And the question was, how much of this management are we going to get involved with? They're going to still have to oversee things. They're going to be overseers, but they also want to enlist some help. And so they create the office of a deacon. But in creating the office of the deacon, they say we're going to do this so that we can give ourselves to the ministry of prayer and the word. So I think whenever someone asks, what does a pastor do? You got to start there. You got to start with prayer and the word. We want to be zealous then to structure the ministry as they did in Acts chapter 6 in order to make that possible. If pastors don't lead well in terms of enlisting people to shoulder the work of the church with them, you've said a couple times already, we have a host of volunteers. If you don't do that, well, then you're going to end up getting burdened you're going to saddled with doing all of that yourself. And many a pastor is in that situation. And how they would love to devote themselves more to the word, more to prayer, but it gets crowded out because they're doing all these other things. So it's probably a good time to just say yet again how thankful we are, right?
Yeah, I was just going to say, and that ties into one of the other key purposes. I'm not sure if you're planning on saying this, but the equipping aspect of that. Pastors equip the saints for the work of the ministry. And if you don't spend time on equipping,
You're dead.
then you're not going to have time for those other things.
There you go.
Yeah,
Exactly. Well said. And Ephesians 4 says that, that we equip the saints for the work of the ministry. So prayer and the word, you got to start there. Prayer for the church, prayer for needs, prayer for wisdom. It's easy for prayer to get crowded out, very easy. And so every pastor I've ever talked to, that's the one of the biggest struggles that we all have, is to not get involved in other things to the detriment of particularly prayer. And then the word, in hours each week, especially if have divided up responsibilities and you're responsible then for the weekly preaching and lion's share of the teaching, then you're going to spend hours each week to think about the passage, to illustrate how can I illustrate this, how can I explain this, then to write it out, which for myself, that's what I do. I just write out like every word and then edit so that it's succinct as possible, and then outline so that we pass out the outline that I was talking about. And just as an aside, I actually started 20 years ago when we started the church giving an outline, and that has remained to this day. And I don't actually know, I haven't taken a poll of how many people benefit from that, but we've done it. I'm sure if we stopped doing it, we would have a decent number of people.
It's like the bagels. It just can't go away.
It can't go away, which is fine. But, honestly, to be perfectly honest, a major reason that I started doing that is we were a new church. We were inviting people to come to this church. They don't know us. And one of the things I wanted them to know early on when they walked through the door was there was some time put into this. And I thought just that small gesture at least indicated that. Because, it's no great shakes, as you know, the outline. It's a short outline, but it takes a little bit to at least think about the flow, how the relationship, how it goes together, all of that. And so they at least know you're not extemporaneous. You're not just getting up and
making it up
as
you go,
And then there's counseling that we get involved in, and there's one-on-one counseling, and then there's counsel by email. I mean, you communicate a lot with people these days by email, by text, over the phone. Administration, you just do an amazing job with the lion's share of the administration here, but then there's some of that falls to all of us, and me as well. For me, meetings and preparing for 2 meetings in particular on a regular basis with the pastoral staff, and then with the leadership team that includes the pastors and the deacons. And as the senior pastor, part of that senior piece is for me to propose an agenda for the pastors. Even though we're all equal, we have decided that one of us is going to be responsible for setting an agenda. And then anybody can add to that agenda. But then we get together, so I have a responsibility to make sure that's there. Okay, guys, this is what I'm saying we should talk about, we should look forward to. And then we discuss it. And that in turn, whatever comes out of that discussion sets the agenda for the larger leadership team, the pastors and the deacons. I have to plan for the future. Here in a couple of weeks, We'll be doing the State of the Church address that we do at the beginning of the year, usually in January. But this year, because Omicron has beset the church so much through January, we decided to wait until everybody hopefully is back in February. And I'll do a couple of weeks that talk about where the church is, where we want to go, and that includes talking about our 10-year plan. And we laid out a 10-year plan. Well, that's part of the administrative thing. Even planning the preaching and the teaching. You know, you and I were just at our staff meeting 2 days ago.
Yeah.
We're talking about, okay, which series are we going to do? What dates are those going to be?
It connects last week's topic and this week's topic because we
Indeed.
kind of plan that out and then strategically plan that out, and then other things fall in around
Lots
it.
of things, events that we do, and then baptisms, and right?
Yeah, outreach emphases.
We have a
yeah.
thing called Pastors in Training, and we've got a young brother in the Lord who's going to seminary right now, who's in that I get to meet with, and we get to go over aspects of pastoral ministry in that he doesn't get in seminary. And that's a lot of these kinds of things that we're talking about. We have to make decisions regularly, big and small. I mean, I spend a lot of my time, you spend a lot of your time with people asking a question, what should I do about this? They're not necessarily all big things. They're not, big problems that they're having. That happens, of course. But sometimes it's just, what do I do with this?
Yeah.
And then we have to make a decision. And you want to make even those small decisions in a wise way, because if you make them without thinking about the ramifications, then you're setting a precedent, and it may be a bad precedent for the future. And so you and I have that discussion a lot.
Yeah.
Should we do this? Because if we do it, it might mean, we don't have to take a lot of time, and we've gotten quicker at it over time.
I was going to say that specifically to the timing on it. If you ever submit a question or have a request about something and it takes a little while for us to get back to you
That's
on it,
what's
it's
going
because we're trying to be intentional about
That's
it.
exactly
Yeah.
it. You got weddings, funerals, you got hospital visits, and then with all of that, you want to tend to your own family.
Yeah.
And thank God, thank the Lord that He has allowed us to do that. Here are our girls. We have 3 girls and 2 girls, so all 5 are grown. But the Lord's allowed us to shepherd them as well. But you can get so tied up in all of these things that you don't do that. You don't give adequate time to that, and many a pastor has done that also.
Yeah. Well, that hopefully it helps shed some light on what pastors do all week. There's a lot that goes into it, and but it's a part of what God's doing in the church overall, the whole body working
Amen.
together. Yeah, so it's a privilege to be able to lead in that process. So thanks for tuning into this episode. As I do every week, I'll remind you, make sure you subscribe to our channel and check the notification bell so that you know when our new episodes come out. We try to put a new episode out every Saturday at 2 o'clock, and we look forward to seeing you in the next one. If you have a question you'd like us to consider, you can send that in to our email address, info@cbctrenton.com, or text it to us at 97000.